So welcome to this podcast number 8. And it's a podcast about the art of listening, the many sides of art of listening. As we've seen in the previous podcasts, there are many things to discuss and to think about. And maybe there are some things which we don't want to think about too much. They've got to be spontaneous, like this podcast. That's the idea that I'm trying to follow, is not to plan too much. It's got to go in its own natural way. Well, I hope you can stand that with me and listen to it and find this interesting. This start, we did in the last podcast something which was very important. The way a note becomes important during a piece. For instance, it's a journey of a note, and what we have in this piece. To explain it very much. The repeating of the A flat is obviously one of the most important things in the whole piece, and it comes later. Very important. What comes after this is such a marvelous moment because it changes to the minor, and listen to what happens then. Just what you can do with one note, how one note can really become significant. We had it in this piece that I played last time. I could have said, what about that first note in the top, this note? The way that keeps repeating and keeps repeating. But I think a little bit more important is what happens here. That note, which ends the piece actually. He ends it with that note. So maybe Chopin found it an important note also. Anyway, that's a little bit what we were discussing in the last podcast. So that's just nice to think about. I think one of these things that we were discussing about the art of listening is so important for us pianists. One of the things I've discovered working with a lot of wonderful young musicians is one of the difficult things is to really hear what we are doing, really to be aware of it, to actually feel the note, but still know this is what we are listening to. Because I think what we are actually listening to when we are playing is actually what the listener hears. I think we project things, we communicate things, not always by talking about them. I think one of the greatest communications of mankind is the things that we just don't have to talk about, the things that we just absolutely feel, our antennas, the antennas that we have are somehow working to give us the idea this is what we are receiving from this person, a communication. So I think it was wonderful what Chopin once wrote. He once wrote somewhere, I don't remember where exactly, but he wrote that he tried in his pieces not to do something which showed too definitely what he felt. He wanted to leave it open that the listener could interpret something in his own or her way. And I think that's a wonderful way of thinking about it. I think we've got to be able to interpret what we are receiving in our own way. Not perhaps too much, but somehow a little bit of interpretation is important. It was, after all, Einstein who said, the logic will get you from A to B, but imagination will get you further. Well, I'm pretty sure he's right. But anyway, we're going to have to go a little bit further than the logic. Huh? So let's try to delve a little further. As I said earlier in these podcasts, I'm not actually planning too much. A few things are important. When we are playing, I think, as I said also earlier, the arms give the way we play. And I think if we're playing old music from the pre-Baroque up until, well, the beginning of the last century, I think the arm is dreadfully important in giving the breathing of a piece. We breathe with the arms. And I think you can hear it in this piece here when you get this. The way it feels, it just lives and breathes. You can feel the way it goes in waves. The waves are important. Now, this is something I think in the art of listening that's important. Most pieces have those waves. Some pieces begin with a question, and often as a result, after the question, you get an answer. Even if I take the last piano sonata by Schubert, one of the greatest works we know. It's just a feeling of a question, and then the answer. And so on. It's very important getting the shape of the music. It's dreadfully important not only in old music, but also definitely in contemporary music. Contemporary music has that also. For instance, when I think of the following, the beginning, for instance, and I got it here, the Boulez Sonata, the second sonata of Boulez. One of the things that I found very important in this piece, in performing, and something which is much sometimes, unfortunately, a little bit not considered. That's this, for instance. And then you get this. And then you get this. And then this. It is a sort of statement. If you listen carefully, we have the first opening, and obviously a statement, and that ends with a short rest. We get this, and we get then this, then a rest, and then you get this, then you get that ascending passage, which then what goes up must usually come down. So all these things are just working on that very first beginning. He uses a 12-tone technique, but we don't really have to think too much about the 12 tones. We don't even have to hear it like that. I think what we've got to hear is the statements, the way it's being built up, the way it develops, and eventually gets incredible, complicated, but still it's very fascinating to follow that. It's quite an achievement as listener to hear these pieces and to be able to try to follow them. And talking about Boulez, I could say the same thing about many other compositions, works by so many different composers. And my colleague, Maurice Verheul, his work also very much is built upon the whole complete entity of the work, not just one little passage of it, but the whole thing, how it's put together, how it's kept together, and the way it sometimes comes from a keen, a basic idea, which is somehow developed in the most incredible ways. Now, there are so many things I would like to discuss. One or two other things I think I would like to talk also a little bit about, as an introduction, about my experience with Surabji, because this was one of the great moments of my life. Surabji's Opus Clave, we call it Opus Clave. Actually, the name is, of course, Opus Clave Symbolisticum, but I'll save you from the whole, let's call it Opus Clave. Actually, the people that know about it just call it OC, and that's the way I've always called it. But anyway, that's another thing. But it just begins with an incredible statement. Let me just show you. I want you to see that or hear that. This is the score. This is the score that I received in 1960. It came to me while I was living in Australia. I was living in Australia, and I had a teacher who had been a student of Busoni, and she told me that I should check up other pieces, unknown pieces. She gave, actually, for just a few lessons that I had with her, or actually they were not lessons, they were more discussions, she told me, you must prepare for me the toccata from Busoni. And that put me on the path of finding Surabji. What happened as a series of events, and eventually I discovered, I was reading a lot about composers in those days, and was reading about the difficulty of being allowed to perform his work. He just refused permission to so many people in those days. There were great pianists playing for him, and they didn't get permission from him. Unfortunate, but he felt that his work was not well represented. And that happened actually because of an unfortunate performance that was given in 1930, and that performance actually was taking too long. He really was quite annoyed about that. He heard that the first movement, the first part of the piece, which should normally take about 55 minutes, took something like about 2 hours or something. And he said it's absolutely just all wrong. He was very, very busy about the length of the piece with me. Anyway, this is the piece. And let me just show you a few things that happen in it, which I think are really worthwhile knowing about. Because with such a long piece, you've got to have a guide. And just like I've mentioned earlier, a sort of museum guide we need. So I'm a museum guide for you now. And here we are. That begins with this. And I must say, every time I began it, you must realize the performances, the very first performances that I gave in the 1980s, they were all, one of them was for the Holland Festival, and there have been festivals in the other parts of the world. And that concert was being live broadcast, and it was being recorded, everything. And they had 2 concert grands for me ready, one next to the other, like here. And they both were all equipped with microphones. Everything was ready because there was going to be a live performance. They were quite worried. Just imagine if something goes wrong with the piano, if the piano breaks a string within 4 hours, that could easily happen. And if it happens, we've got to be able to move quickly to the other instrument, because we can't afford to start from the beginning again. Okay, well, that's being said, I remember when I come onto the stage and I'm about to play that first opening, I'm thinking, my oh my, here we go. This is going to be it. And you feel at that moment almost the whole entity of the work. The whole piece is somehow in your feeling. You feel it. And this is, I think, what the miracle is from this composition. And people often say it's a very difficult piece. Okay, it's difficult. We know that. It's all. I don't like talking about the difficulty of pieces. Everything's easy when you know how to do it. It's just like someone was asking Shostakovich once, how did he write symphonies? And he just mentioned, I know how to do it. Well, I guess he's right. He certainly proved it, didn't he? Anyway, here we are. Here is the beginning of the Sarabji. Do that, we were going for another 4 hours, and that's not completely the idea of this podcast. But so that's how it begins, an incredibly huge beginning, and he writes so many things. This first motive that comes back in different ways in the piece. You hear that several times during the piece. The whole score has been based on Busoni's Fantasia Contrapuntistica, one of the great works of Busoni, in which he actually is making as a sort of improvisation on certain fugues of the Kunstfuge of Bach. Amazing, also an amazing piece. Sarabji was fascinated by this piece. And this piece was inspired by that. So he actually really built it on the same lines as the Fantasia Contrapuntistica from Busoni, who he knew he actually played for Busoni at one stage. He told me a little bit about that, but that's another story. That's for another podcast later. The trouble is, when you choose to pick anything out of this piece and play it, the trouble is there's so much that you don't play, which is just as important and possibly even more important. It's just like taking one little part of the Night Watch of Rembrandt or something, and saying this is the basic idea of the piece. No, it doesn't work that way. You've got to see the whole piece and be able to take in that colossal entity of the whole piece. Well, this is what we have here. And there are passages which I love. I remember when I come to this passage, it's this. Wonderful moments, just stately. And that's another thing I wanted to talk about. We hear this music, so much is happening, but it's not only the notes that are important, it's the feeling and the mood behind the notes that makes them organic, that makes it fit together. And this is one of the things, it's not easy to do that. I think it's a different thing to play this in a studio or to actually perform it live. It doesn't quite work the same way. I think every pianist will often say that their live performances are often different than what they did later or earlier in the studio. That applies certainly to me, and I think that applies to almost everyone. The spontaneity of giving a live performance. I love always what Arthur Rubinstein once said, and he said it so beautifully. He said, I like my performances to have a feeling of danger. They shouldn't be too studied. And he went on to say something which I always found quite fascinating. He said, I gave once a performance that I had worked very carefully on everything. I had really worked it out like anything. And he said that this was not a good recital, which I don't believe actually, but anyway, he said that. And the other story is that he said, but on the other hand, I've played sometimes concerts without having been able to study very much. And I have not had the time to prepare. And they were wonderful concerts. So there we have the wonderful, wonderful miracle of performance. What it can do when we don't really plan too much. I think we've got to plan some things, but not always too much. And these days we're perhaps doing a little bit too much planning. But anyway, another thing, that's another story for later. But, well, I would get excited if I just look through this and think, what am I going to do? You know, the difficulty is I haven't been preparing it, and this is a work without any question you've got to prepare. There's no way of just getting up and playing. I used to do that, but I'm a little bit older now. You won't notice that, of course, but I'm a little bit older. And, well, if you do notice it, you can say it even. I don't mind it that much. But anyway, I used to play it really just like this, but now I'm a bit at the age that I've got to really consider what I've got to do, and I'm fascinated by so many different things and working on how we really work on these things. So that's a little bit my story for today, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to it, and I hope I've been able to give some idea of what I'm busy with and what I think is really wonderful to work on. Thanks a lot for listening.